But in 2006, there was a book published called Following the Footsteps of Matteo Ricci to China. And it's the #1 book in China right now about Matteo Ricci. And in the book, which was made widely available to all foreigners who were coming to view the Olympics, Matteo Ricci is a very large figure in China today. But in any case, let me just give you a quote from that text. It notes that when Ricci lived in Beijing, his, quote, major task was entering the Forbidden City 4 times a year to repair the chiming clocks, end quote. Matteo Ricci's major task was to repair the chiming clocks in the Forbidden City. Well, in addition to that, he made good contributions to astronomy, cartography, and various in Euclidean geometry, but nowhere in the text does it mention Ricci as a priest. He's a Jesuit, yes, but Jesuits in China equal scientists, at least today. I think this is very telling about Matteo Ricci. And certainly, Matteo Ricci was the first Westerner to enter the Forbidden City. He was the first to produce a Chinese Western language dictionary. The list of firsts for Matteo Ricci is enormous. And he's rightly the founder of sinology. He's the founder of China studies. In fact, he's probably rightly called the founder of Asian studies today. Yet anyone who's a sinologist or an Asian studies person, they only imagine Matteo Ricci as a dictionary producer or a cartographer. So that's an important thing to sort of keep in mind. One of the most important questions related to this is how Ricci approached the missionary enterprise in a completely pagan culture, yet his goal wasn't to bring them science originally. Clocks were not part of his paradigm, really. And by the way, incidentally, as I bring this up, I should note that in Buddhism in China today, in Buddhism, the bodhisattva of clocks, the Buddhist deity that you approach, who will fix your clocks if your clock does not work, is actually Limado Pusa, which means the bodhisattva Matteo Ricci. So Buddhist temples, you can buy a statue of Matteo Ricci to basically keep your clocks in working order. That's a tangent. It's not even in my lecture notes. But in any case, one of the questions people really think about today was he a secular scientist who drew maps, mastered Confucian philosophy, and repaired clocks, or was he at heart a dedicated Christian? And this was the question that really the Dominicans and the Franciscans were asking when they began their mission in China. I think one thing that we need to do to understand Ricci is put him in the context of his European upbringing. That is, he was a Jesuit, and Jesuits formed themselves out of the mire of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. Certainly there was this Jesuit impulse that if we're losing Europe to the church, well, we've got to go someplace else, and go, especially someplace with so many people. If we can win China to the church, then we have this Goliath, this Catholic Goliath that will help us really to sort of empower ourselves in light of the Reformation that was happening in Europe. So Ricci is traveling to China with this almost imperative to try and be a missionary as part of this whole Counter-Reformation effort. And one point I want to make too is that from the Jesuit point of view, if you're going to win people to the faith, especially in terms of this emerging Protestant population, you have to not only be a pious person, and I'd like to sort of think that our seminaries today should think about this ideal also. You shouldn't just be pious, but you need to have intellectual capability. That is, you need to be more pious and smarter than the people that you encounter. So from Ricci's point of view, the whole, as a Jesuit, in the Counter-Reformation context, going to China, one must be highly educated. So Ricci, when he first arrived in China, his goal wasn't just to bring Euclidean geometry to China, but his goal was, well, if I'm going to become an interlocutor with Buddhists and Confucians, I have to be a smarter Buddhist and a smarter Confucian than my opponents. So he set himself to not only studying Buddhism and not only studying Confucianism, but literally memorizing their texts, their classic texts. That is, I remember for myself, when I started studying the Analects of Confucius, my professor said, well, I'd like you to memorize the first chapter by next Tuesday or next Monday, I think it was. And I remember walking around campus with the Analects of Confucius, mumbling to myself, 自月学而时习之，不亦乐乎？有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎？人不知而不愠，不亦知之乎? And I think my fellow classmates thought I was insane. I was doing this on the bus, but I did it. And Ricci realized that really in Chinese society, the way you distinguish yourself is by memorization, by memorizing these texts. So Ricci memorized the Confucian classics. He used this European aid. There's a book by Jonathan Spence called The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci that deals with the system that Ricci used to memorize these Confucian texts. Well, we've seen that Ricci traveled with the crucifix, and he traveled with other holy objects required to celebrate Mass. He also carried instruments for cartography and charting stars. So really, to understand Ricci, we have to understand in not only the Jesuit imperative in the Counter-Reformation to go out and master knowledge and to be pious, to be able to engage interlocutors in debate, but also this idea that one needs to understand the opponent's point of view. That's important to sort of keep in mind. So you have to win in the battlefields of the soul and the mind. Ricci had studied from two famous intellectuals, the great German mathematician Christophanus Clavius and the Italian theologian and defender of the church, Saint Roberto Bellarmine. He has an incredible intellectual pedigree. And his system of thinking about learning was very much steeped in the Jesuit quadrivium and very much steeped in this idea of memorization and textual learning, which prepared him well for the Confucian system, because from the Confucian point of view, the way you distinguish yourself is through the mastery of texts. So Ricci, in a sense, was very well prepared for this. The other thing I should note about Ricci is that wherein his other confreres who were interested in learning Chinese, they wanted to learn the dialect of their region. So this is an important point. So for example, if you're in southern China, the way I might introduce myself is 我係我黑本 1 through 10 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Cantonese. But Ricci understood that the language of the official class wasn't Cantonese. The language of the official class, the people who were most spread out all through China, was Mandarin, the language of the capital, the language of Beijing. So instead of 我係我黑本我是何水兵 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 very different dialectically. And when Ricci set out to learn Mandarin, he was really the first to do this. He was learning the language that would ingratiate him to the scholar official class, which is an important step. And the other thing, the other point I should make is that his mastery of difficult Confucian texts and the Mandarin language was less an example of his conversion to China's culture and religions than a method of, it's an important point, of demonstrating Christ's truth above secular wisdom. So as Howard Goodman is a friend of mine who's also done work at the Vatican, he notes that Ricci, quote, worked with texts, Confucian classics that he mastered as the price of entrance to conversation with the Chinese elite and Western classics that gave him the authority to offer an alternative to Confucianism. So basically, he was mastering Chinese culture not to become Chinese, in a sense, but to basically earn the price of admission into discussion with these Confucian scholars.